Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for coming out despite the wonderful weather. It's so great to see so many faces in person. It is our pleasure to welcome you to the annual 15th Global Health Night and the 2023 Friesen Prize Public Lecture. Tonight's theme is Crisis to Cure, Climate, Health, and Sustainable Future. My name is Yasmin Elmi. I'm going to be one of the co-MCs for tonight. I'm a second-year master's student in the Family Medicine Department. I was a McCall McBain Scholar in 2022 and a 2023 Global Health Scholar this year.
Hi everyone, my name is Alua Kulanova. I am also a student in the Master of Science program in Family Medicine, concentration Global Health in my second year. I am the editor-in-chief of the McGill Journal of Global Health this year, and I was a 2021 Global Health Scholar.
And hi, everyone. My name is Palami Sen. I am a second-year medical student here at McGill, and this past summer I was also a Global Health Scholar. Thank you.
We are gathered tonight on the unceded territory of the Kanien'kehá:ka First Nation, a place that has long served as a site of meeting and exchange between members of the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabeg First Nations. We strive to recognize and dismantle the presently enduring effects of colonization perpetuated by Canada, and we celebrate the resilience of Indigenous peoples against these structures. We thank the diverse Indigenous peoples whose presence will always mark this territory. Our duty as global health researchers, academics, and professionals does not end at merely acknowledging the land that we gather on. We must recognize the ways in which patterns of colonialism have not only historically dominated the global health sphere, but continue to shape our knowledge and practices today. Colonialism intercepts with and exacerbates other structures of inequity and oppression within and between societies across this world. We must also recognize how we can both be negatively impacted by or benefit from these structures. And with this recognition, we will be empowered with the responsibility to undertake a lifelong journey of self-education, learning with humility, and centering Indigenous communities and knowledge in the fight for social justice and equity for all.
Tonight, we will first hear from Professor Christopher Manfredi, Provost and Vice Principal Academic at McGill University, who will share some welcoming remarks. Following Professor Manfredi, just to be clear, I'm going to give a breakdown of how today is going to work. Thank you, Professor Manfredi. And afterwards, we'll hear from Dr. Leslie Fellows, Vice Principal Health Affairs and Dean of the Faculty of Medicine and Health Sciences, who will provide some opening remarks. Afterwards, we will hear from Dr. Charles Larson, the director of the McGill Global Health Programs, who will provide us with an update on GHP and some reflections on the past 15 years of Global Health Night. Dr. Larson will be followed by our special guest, the Honorable Dr. Keith Martin, who will deliver the first keynote lecture titled Averting Disaster, How We Can Bend the Curve on the Climate Biodiversity Pollution Crisis. Then Dr. Malkin will provide us with an overview of the Friesen Prize and the Friends of the Canadian Institutes of Health Research. This will segue into the 2023 Friesen Prize Public Lecture delivered by Dr. Zulfikar Bhutta, the recipient of the 2023 Henry Friesen International Prize in Health Awards. Afterwards, we will have an interactive question and answer session with both of our keynote lectures hosted by Dr. Jill Baumgartner and Ms. Emma Bouajiti. This event will then wrap up with the closing remarks from Dr. Timothy Evans, Associate Dean and Director of the School of Population and Global Health, as well as Associate VP, Global Policy and Innovation.
And I'm just going to end off with some housekeeping remarks. So for those of us joining us online, please follow the link in the description below the video window on YouTube in order to put in your questions for the keynote speakers during the live Q&A session. And we also encourage you to use the hashtag McGillGHN 2023 when posting on social media. That would be greatly appreciated. And now, without further ado, I would like to welcome to the stage Professor Christopher Manfredi, Provost and Vice Principal Academic of McGill University. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Yasmin, Alua, and Palami. Thank you for that introduction, even though I jumped the gun a little bit. Bonsoir et bienvenue à tous et toutes. Il me fait grand plaisir de me joindre à vous et de participer à cet événement exceptionnel. Welcome to the 15th Annual McGill Global Health Night and the 2023 Friesen Prize Public Lecture. It's a pleasure to see our international community of donors, students, residents, fellows, and professors coming together today. Tonight's theme rightly emphasizes the immediate connection between climate change and health, highlighting the path towards a more secure and healthier future. McGill University places sustainability at the core of all its teaching, research, and community service activities to ensure its position as a global leader, and the outstanding work done through McGill's global health programs is essential to making this commitment a reality. I'd like to extend my heartfelt thanks to Professor Charles Larson, Director of McGill Global Health Programs, and Professor Madhukar Pai, the inaugural Chair of the Department of Global and Public Health. Under the visionary leadership of Dr. Larson and Dr. Pai, our global health programs have flourished over the past 15 years. Their dedication, along with that of former Dean David Eidelman and Dr. Tim Evans, inaugural Director and Associate Dean of the School of Population and Global Health, has been remarkable, and I know it will be driven forward very ably by Dean Fellows. The growth of McGill's global health programs owes a great deal to the support of our generous donors, some of whom are present tonight, both in person and online. Your continued support enables our students to pursue life-changing opportunities, and we are sincerely grateful. This evening's poster fairs showcase the impressive work of our students from across the university, driving toward global health research internationally and here in Canada, and I want to congratulate each and every one of you. Tonight, we have the honor to host two highly esteemed keynote speakers. We are delighted to welcome Dr. Keith Martin, Founding Executive Director of the Consortium of Universities for Global Health and a former member or current member of the Privy Council. We are also fortunate to host Dr. Zulfikar Bhutta, Founding Director of the Institute for Global Health and Development and the Center of Excellence in Women and Child Health at Aga Khan University and co-director of Sick Kids Center for Global Child Health. Dr. Bhutta, the recipient of the 2023 Henry G. Friesen International Prize in Health Research, will deliver the annual Friesen Lecture this evening. McGill remains dedicated to leveraging its educational and research strengths to address major challenges, including those at the nexus of climate change and global health. The contributions of McGill students and scholars in the interdisciplinary field of global health will continue to be a source of pride and will undoubtedly have a meaningful impact on lives worldwide. Merci encore de votre présence et je vous souhaite à tous et toutes une agréable soirée et des échanges fructueux. Merci. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Manfredi, for those welcoming remarks. Next, we will hear from Dr. Leslie Fellows, the Vice Principal, Health Affairs and Dean of the Faculty of Medicine and Health Sciences. She will provide opening remarks. Please welcome Dean Fellows.
Thank you. Bonsoir tout le monde. C'est un vrai plaisir de la part de la Faculté de Médecine et des Sciences de la Santé de vous accueillir en si grand nombre et si souriant. It's a real pleasure to welcome you on behalf of the Faculty of Medicine and Health Sciences. Thank you, Provost Manfredi, for being here and for those inspiring words. And a special welcome to our distinguished guests and to those joining online. I've been the Dean of the Faculty of Medicine and Health Sciences for a few months now, actually. I've started to learn the whole title in French and English, so I'm feeling good about that. I really enjoy these kinds of activities. It's really a pleasure to come and see the work that's being done, and especially to have these in-person events where we can really exchange and talk to each other and see what's going on, and it's always really inspiring to see what what the students and the faculty and in their collaborations with other institutions across the university have been doing. I congratulate the Global Health Programs on its 15th Global Health Night. That's something. That's real continuity. I think it speaks to the importance of what's going on at these events. The Global Health Programs, as the Provost mentioned, has been a priority for the university and for the faculty all along, and we've been happy to support the work of the people running Global Health Programs and the students and faculty who have been so involved. I add my welcome to and congratulations to Dr. Zulfikar Bhutta and Dr. Keith Martin, and I'm really looking forward to hearing their remarks. I'd like to also acknowledge and thank the members of the Global Health Programs International Advisory Council, the GHP Executive Council, the donors, the students, residents, and professors for all your contributions to the field of global health and for your part in tonight's events. I've been thinking a lot about the social mission of the Faculty of Medicine and Health Sciences lately. And I think the posters that I was touring just before we started now really kind of distill or represent the nature of that social mission. It's our particular role in our faculty to serve the communities, that we are part of, and I think it's important to think about what those communities are. Of course, they're the communities right around the corner, around the slushy corners of Montreal, but also across Quebec. Our new campus Outaouais as an example of us being very much implanted in the different regions of Quebec, and across particularly the north and Indigenous communities in Quebec, which I see have been a special focus of global health, which is great. But we don't stop at the borders of Quebec. Of course, our scope stretches, the communities that we serve stretch all around the world, and I think I need to tell this audience that even the idea of global health in a way is almost a redundancy, that health is obviously everywhere, and that we can't be thinking about health in a very narrow way, that what goes on around the world has an impact, and the pandemic really brought that home very directly. So I'm really pleased that we have this legacy of working on this, working on health at all these levels of analysis in terms of the locality of health and the peoples who make up our communities, whether here in Montreal or globally. So I'm really excited about the work that's being done in the global health programs and the work that you're doing. I think the big challenges that we're facing are clearly challenges that require all of us, and that require interdisciplinarity and still require us to be rigorous and good scientists, and that's a challenge. And I'm looking forward to hearing from the speakers today and from you at the end of the sessions to see how you're meeting those challenges. Thank you.
Un grand merci à Dean Fellows pour votre message. And now I would like to introduce and welcome to the stage Dr. Charles Larson, the director of the McGill Global Health Programs, who will be providing an update on the activities under the umbrella of the Global Health Programs Office and a reflection on the past 15 years of Global Health Nights. Please welcome to the stage Dr. Larson.
Thank you, Jacine. Good evening to all of you. I want to welcome you, as others already have, to this 15th Annual Global Health Night. I'd also like to welcome any of you who come from outside Montreal to Winter 2023. A special thanks to Professor Manfredi and to our new Dean, Leslie Fellows, for their opening remarks. Last year, there was a lot of gloom and doom in my talk, and as a result, they've cut me by 50%. I'm obliged this year, and in fact, I very much want to be upbeat and reflect on the past 15 years and the tremendous work that all those involved with Global Health Program and those who've experienced Global Health Program initiatives So with that, let's begin with a look at our last 15 years of Global Health Night. We've been very fortunate to have had 15 amazing keynote speakers over those 15 years. And you see them photographed here. What you don't see photographed are the amazing number of students that have gone through global health programs and have benefited, have presented here with posters that like we've seen tonight. You don't see them, and they really need to deserve full credit for their engagement with the program and with Global Health Night. The other thing you don't see are the faculty, who have been incredible mentors of these students, and very much, again, is reflected in the quality of the posters that you see. So what have we done in the past 15 years? Well, I'm not going to mention everything, but I thought I'd highlight a few, I think, of some of the more outstanding achievements. And that starts with over 600 Global Health student posters since we started Global Health Night in 2009. 550 awards distributed to students since 2011. These would be Global Health Scholars or Travel Awards. We have, as you well know, a Summer Institute. It began in 2015 with, I believe, 7 courses and focused on infectious diseases. 2 years ago, we upped that to 3 different institutes, one in rehabilitation sciences, another in, it's an odd name, but it's an incredible set of courses on peace, health, and sustainability. We've also partnered with an NGO to do that, Pegasus Institute. We've also partnered with the University of Ottawa, and I think it's important to begin thinking about how we can partner with other institutions in providing our services. We don't need to do it all alone. And with the University of Ottawa, we've offered courses in global health, advocacy, and governance. 224 student journal articles and blog posts have been published in the McGill Journal of Global Health and the McGill Perspectives on Global Health since 2018. We've had 12 Steinberg funds for interdisciplinary global health seed grants since 2016. And we hope with additional funding that we can continue with that in the future. Our flagship is offering opportunities for students through our Global Health Scholars Program and travel scholarships. The Global Health Scholars 2024 cohort will also continue with what we've been doing for the past 16 years, which is Global Health Scholarships for our undergraduate and graduate students. We never can meet the need. Last year, in the undergraduate program, we had 106 applications. We could only fill 25. I wish we could do more, and we're doing a lot, but we're not meeting this really incredible demand. I think we had nearly 25 applicants and could only fund 8 graduate students with our Global Scholars Program. We have a new program on informed investment in health innovation. This will offer 4 scholarships each year and introduce students to how to cost and the cost benefit of global health initiatives. There is a call right now among faculty. Any of you are here who haven't thought about putting in an application for a student for a summer scholarship, please do so, as you got until next week to do that. Once we have those and we vet them, we will be opening them up in the new year, early in the new year, for students to apply to. And that'll be both undergraduate and graduate students. As I mentioned, we have a rolling application for Global Health Travel Awards. So anytime during the year, you're able to come to us if you're in need of a travel award. We have a Student Initiatives Fund, and that covers student clubs or chapters who are looking and want to put on a special event. We can provide them with up to $1,000 for each event. And I encourage any of you who are members of student clubs or chapters to please apply for that opportunity. And then we continue with our global health outreach projects, and that includes the McGill Perspectives on Global Health, as well as the McGill Journal of Global Health. I mentioned the summer institutes. This past year, we had 1,169 participants. Most importantly, over half came from low and middle income countries. We would like to see that even higher, quite frankly. Most of our courses are offered remotely. We do have one in-person course. We'd like to do more in-person courses, but we all are aware of the struggles that those who come from outside Canada have just obtaining a visa, in particular those from low and middle income countries. That's something that we're working on, and in unison with others across Canada. I know, Provost Manfredi, that you've been engaged with this and we're well aware of the issues around obtaining a visa. And we need to continue, all of us need to continue to promote efforts to hasten and improve the process, and also any discrimination that might occur in that process. We had 87 countries participate. Participants came from 87 different countries, and we offered 15 courses this past year. I want to note that we couldn't do what we're doing if we didn't have these incredible students that we do have in our Scholars Program. We had a tea earlier today where we had a chance to briefly hear through roundtables, speed roundtables, where we could hear from the projects could hear from some of our guests, experts, and quiz them on why they went into global health, which is always interesting to hear the answers that they come up with. I haven't got time to introduce all these global health scholars, but any of you who are here tonight, would you please stand up? Don't be shy. Get up, stand up, stand up. Let's have an applause for them. Okay, looking ahead. Well, I think most importantly, we're very much and very proud to be part of this new Department of Global and Public Health. I think it's fair to say that the Global Health Programs played a very instrumental role in preparing the proposal for the new department, and we're extremely pleased to have Dr. Pai as our inaugural chair, and looking forward to lots of new possibilities and initiatives in public health as well as in global health. We need to focus on cross-cutting programs. We need to continue to improve our ability to engage people outside of the Faculty of Medicine and Health Sciences, and we will continue to do that. We offer a number of ours, you probably saw on posters, some of our scholars do come from other faculties here at McGill. I need to thank our donors. We're incredibly fortunate. As you can see from the list, this is a list of over 30, and it enables us to offer over $120,000 a year in support for scholarships. So thank you very much. I can't thank you enough. Those of you who are in the audience are donors. Greatly, greatly appreciated. And I want to finally just say thank you to our Executive Council and International Advisory Council, who you see on the left, and to our staff team. I think it's important for me to recognize that I would like each of our staff to stand up. We have Jesse Ratz, who's our events coordinator. We have Ki Annie Wu, who is our student affairs administrator. Where are you, Kel? Somewhere in here. There she is. Kevin O'Neill, our program manager. Kristen Hendricks, our Summer Institute project manager. And Stephanie LaRoche-Pierre, who is the bedrock of global health programs. We couldn't do anything without her. She's our senior administrative coordinator. Where is Stephanie? Okay, so my time is up. I want to thank you all for this opportunity to give you this overview, and I'll turn it over to Pauline.
Steps are a little tricky. So thank you, Dr. Larson, for your insightful reflection on 15 years of Global Health Night. As a student, I can say I'm very appreciative of this office, and so thank you so much. And now we will transition to the first keynote address of the evening. So it is an absolute honor to introduce our first esteemed keynote speaker, the Honorable Dr. Keith Martin. Dr. Keith Martin is the founding executive director of the Consortium of Universities for Global Health since 2012. And he has served as a member of Parliament in Canada's House of Commons for nearly 20 years and is a member of the Queen's Privy Council for Canada. Dr. Martin held shadow ministerial portfolios in foreign affairs, as well as international development and health, and served as Canada's parliamentary secretary for defense. He is a physician who frequently partakes in diplomatic missions in areas of crisis with particular focus across Africa. Indeed, Dr. Martin practiced medicine on the Mozambique border during their civil war. And he has authored more than 170 published editorial pieces and has appeared frequently as a commentator on television and the radio. So Dr. Martin has been a longstanding advocate for climate action as well. So please join me in welcoming the Honorable Dr. Keith Martin to the stage.
Thank you, Palami, very much for your kind introduction. Do I have a clicker at all? Ah, fantastic. Merci beaucoup. Bienvenue à tous. Merci beaucoup. C'est un grand plaisir d'être ici. It's just lovely to see everybody, and it's just such an honor to be here, everybody. And I over the years, seeing the growth of these programs, congratulations to all of you. Honestly, it is inspiring to see what you've accomplished here. And I wanted to just to say that tonight is, although we're talking about climate change, this is not a night for doom scrolling, right? This is a night for celebration. And so we're going to celebrate tonight, and we're going to go on a little trip and a voyage, which I hope will take us to a place that all of you will go out and saying, yes, we can. But before I do that, I just want to congratulate Dr. Evans, and now leading the School of Programs of Public Health, Dr. Larson for his extraordinary, and I'll get to this in a minute, extraordinary efforts over many years here in McGill and beyond. Dr. Pai, congratulations. You remember the good old days coming down to our conference at CIHR and the great work you did to bring folks to our conference, including the leadership here, to our international conference. I also just want to say also for Dr. Larson. Dr. Larson, for those of you may or may not know, has sat on our board of directors. Now, there's not a lot of Canadians, right? Well, there are Canadians, a lot of Canadians in the US, but in positions to bring our countries together, there are not a lot. But Dr. Larson, over the entire duration of his time that I've been at CIHR, has worked tirelessly to not only show the flag of McGill in Washington, D.C., which is needed. I know it's taped. But also the flag of Quebec, the flag of Canada, and has worked tirelessly to bring our countries, to bring the United States and Canada together, and to be able to bring global health what you're doing here to the world. So Charles, honestly, I couldn't do my job without you as executive director, and so I owe you an enormous debt of gratitude. And if you'll permit me another personal note, I'm really honored to be here with my friend, Dr. Zulfi Bhutta. Now, I knew Dr. Henry Friesen when I was in Parliament. Now, Dr. Friesen, as those of you may know, is one of Canada's most extraordinary scientists. He is a kind, compassionate, humble, absolute force of nature. You don't want to get in the way of him. But I think that, he came to my office, and I was a 30-year-old, know-nothing member of Parliament. Now, can you imagine Dr. Friesen coming to your office as a 30-something-odd-year-old saying, Dr. Martin, I want to create a Canadian Institutes for Health Research. Can you help me? The only answer to that is yes, right? There's only one response to that. So I know that in the example that Dr. Friesen gives to all of us as a humble servant who puts the welfare of people before all of what he has done, that Dr. Bhutta is an exemplar of that and well-deserved of this award. So Zulfi, congratulations. And also I just want to echo Dr. Larson's comments that for the team at your Global Health Programs, including Tasha Anda, who's there. Tasha, you've been an awesome collaborator with us. Thank you for all your hard work. That for the whole team, Kevin, Jesse, Stephanie, the whole team, it's like herding cats, right? We're not easy to do. But thank you for your patience, and you all did an incredible job. So let me go to the first slide. Great. All right. So although the gist of the matter tonight is climate change, I want you to think through this together. Do you remember when you were younger, right? You remember when you were out December and January. Do you know the number of times there was grass on the ground? Not a lot, right? We were skating on ice rinks. There were 6-foot snowbanks. That was our reality when we were younger. Also, do you remember, and this may or may not strike you, that there were monarch butterflies, there were insects, there were grasshoppers. There were a lot of more life in our world. That's not the case anymore. So we don't have, my friends, one existential challenge. We actually have 3. Now, I don't want to make this as being something negative, but the incredible thing about this is that they're all connected. We're the ones who are driving this, but we're the ones who can solve it. And the amazing thing about this is that what we do for one will impact others and have all kinds of downstream effects on the social determinants of health that Dean Fellows was talking about a few minutes ago. And I'm going to show you how. So on the top is a really scary photograph of the Okanagan Valley. Now, who's been to the Okanagan Valley in British Columbia? Yeah. That's frightening for those of you who know this, right? It's a beautiful part of our country. But that was what was happening this summer in the climate change fires that incinerated a whole chunk of my province. On your left is a prairie caribou. Why did I put that up there? Because it's part of the other existential threat that gets short shrift, and that is the global biodiversity crisis. Why is this important? It is not about beautiful animals like this, but what's happening under our feet, from the tiniest creatures to the biggest mammals in the ocean, is that the foundation of life on this planet is being ripped apart. Why is that important? Food, security, the list is long, human development, jobs, they're all affected by this. And last on is pollution. I'm going to do less on this one, but there's a lot of interesting work on the impact of pollution from microplastics to beyond, and it's frightening. But there's good news in this, believe it or not, and I'm going to get to it. So, and this was just the example on the biodiversity crisis. We've lost 68% of all living species, vertebrate living species on the planet just in our lifetimes, for those of you who've been around since 1970, which is not all of you. So this is pretty scary. And one of the major driver now is climate change. So what we're dealing with, you might think, is an environmental challenge. But what I'm going to suggest to you is this is not primarily an environmental challenge. It's primarily a political problem. Why do I say that? First, if you think about it, right, do we or do we not know how to deal with most of the challenges that are there? Exactly, we do. So why isn't it happening? Let's take a voyage into the land of the COP. What is that? The Conference of the Parties. So periodically, right, the world gets together and we all come together as the international community to come out with an effort to deal with a challenge. In this case, it's on climate change, and it's happening this month in Dubai. Now, it's COP28. There's 27 COPs before that, 27 meetings. We're worse off now than we were in the first COP. Now, if you were, we were talking about between Ruben and Toya, I think we were talking about soccer games, right? Playing football, playing soccer. If you were playing hockey or soccer and you were part of a team, and you had 27 losing sessions, would you keep the same strategy? Oh man, that was a softball. Yeah. Would you keep the same? You can ask them, are they keeping the same strategy and connected to climate change? That would be very funny. But if you were doing something 27 times in a row, would you keep the same strategy? No, you would not. But we are. So what happens when you go to a COP? I was at the COP15, which is a great honor to be here in Montreal. It was wonderfully run. Incredible efforts by brilliant people come together. And it's inspiring to see all these amazing, phenomenal individuals from around the world come together, committed to dealing with climate change or biodiversity. So it'll be climate change. Huge efforts. People stay up all night long to come out and develop an accord that everybody can agree to. And I can tell you, huge sweat equity is put into this. An accord is produced. The world signs on to this accord. It's as strong as its weakest link. But what happens? Everybody pats themselves on the back. There's a lot of congratulations. You remember the Paris Accord, the Kyoto Agreement, right? Where are they? We're worse off now, much worse off now, than when they were signed. How come? When you sign on to that and you go home, what happens when you go home? Reality sets in, right? So are the urgencies of dealing with climate change are political questions. So when you go home and you're sitting at the cabinet table, so imagine you're the environment minister at the cabinet table. Do you have the power? No. The environment ministers don't have the power at the cabinet table. The finance ministers do. The prime minister, president's representatives do. They're the ones who are going to call the shots. So when you get home, the political urgency and the reason for doing this is often actually vastly overshadowed by other things. Jobs, economics. The rubber hits the road at a local, domestic, political level. So we have this discrepancy, right? We have this international effort and people go home because the actual agent for change is not international. It's actually domestic, it's state, province, and it's local. Second, if you sign on, it's too easy to game the system, right? If you sign on and say, oh, we did a good job, you go home and you don't sign on, what are the consequences to that? Zip. There's no enforcement mechanism to act on what you agreed to. There's no obligation to act. So we have a political problem that requires a political solution. Here's an interesting thing. When we argue back home in terms of this, if we want action on climate change, we have to show that the domestic benefits to dealing with the climate threats are greater than the forces that exist now. Interesting thing happened at the last COP. Do you remember that there was all of this celebration about billions of dollars that were going to be invested into climate change by private capital? Remember that? A few months later in the New York Times, an interesting article came out. Somebody said, well, where were they investing their money? Oh, lo and behold, while they were telling the rest of the world that they were going to invest in climate change, they were investing billions of dollars into fossil fuel exploration. Another interesting thing, if you want to look at, just in the last week or so, a report on McKinsey came out. Again, I think it was in The Guardian or the New York Times. And the McKinsey report was interesting. As McKinsey was advising the folks in Dubai for the COP this month on a plan to address climate change, their reductions totally missed the mark on what was necessary. But as part of their solution to this was the investment of billions of dollars into fossil fuel exploration. So that's the political dynamic taking place. And I'm saying this just because we have to deal with that. So we have to show in the short-termism of politics, which is a term, right, in terms of you want to get elected, it's your term. We have to show that the benefits of what we want to address this are greater than the current benefits to what counts at the ballot box, jobs and the economy. It's not, with the greatest respect, human rights and equity. We talk about that, and it's good, but that's not what's going to drive action. Here's the other interesting thing. When we come together at the COP, there's the global community gets together and signs on. But the actual producers in this is actually quite narrow. Only 20 countries, 20 nations, contribute 75 to 80% of all emissions. And only 4 sectors, right? Energy, transportation, industry, and agriculture. There's only 4 sectors that contribute the bulk of emissions, 80% of emissions, and only 20 countries. So if you really want to hit this head on, the place to do it is actually much smaller. And this is what we need to focus on. If we're really serious about dealing with this, that's the group we have to hit. So what can we do in terms of what is that value proposition? Here's the interesting thing. If we fail to deal with climate change, biodiversity, and pollution, right, there are costs. There's costs to inaction, which we don't talk about enough, but they're quite huge. The second thing is if we do address these challenges, you can generate jobs, you can strengthen your economy, and that's the political capital, what we need to talk about to politicians to get action. So what are some of those things we can do? Well, our target has to be congruent, our actions need to be congruent with our target. We need to reduce our emissions by 50% by 2030. That's our target, right? And we're way off that. As I said, the actual rate of change in global warming is not linear. It's actually accelerating for multiple reasons we can talk about later. What can we do? A carbon tax. That's the first thing. The second thing is you got to have money to pay for this, right? It's got to come from somewhere. Low-hanging fruit, end the subsidies to fossil fuels, and transition that to using a green economy. Changing regulations for utilities. Now, this sounds like boring as all heck, right? But imagine if utilities are what are producing energy, but governments can tell those utility companies that you have to produce 50%, 60%, 70% of your energy from renewable sources. That forces them to act. We ignore this all the time, yet it's a change in regulations that can have a profound impact upon climate change. Fuel efficiency standards, changing building codes. Canada was once a leader in how we build buildings, and how we build buildings can have a powerful effect on climate change. It's pretty extraordinary. Protecting biodiverse hotspots. I'll get to this in a second. And then marine protected areas, because marine protected areas actually absorb carbon dioxide. Lastly, in order to address the systems change, we've got to bring those 20 emitting countries together and develop a mechanism that they have an obligation to act, and a way in which there's the penalties if they don't. So we often talk about right, reducing emissions, but there's another thing, but that's not going to be enough. Another thing we can do and should be doing, which is easy, is pulling carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. We need to reduce emissions and pull CO2 out of the atmosphere. How can we do it? Well, you can do it the expensive way and the complicated way, like carbon capture, or you can do it the cheap way, which is to protect ecosystems. because ecosystems will pull CO2 out of the atmosphere and they'll bury it into the ground. So you need to protecting our biodiverse hotspots will not only address climate change, but it's also going to deal with the biodiversity crisis. And what's really interesting is that these biodiverse hotspots are also really close to indigenous communities. So those indigenous communities you can work with them for them to manage those sites, which will create jobs and resources for them and funding. And that will reduce rural poverty and create the resources for the social determinants of health that they don't have. So we don't do much of this, but it's a huge opportunity. Finally, we've got to, if we're going to be able to bridge the gap, you've got to have these things in place, right? The knowledge, which you're producing, the skilled personnel, the infrastructure, the finances, the long-term political commitment. If you don't have these in place, then you're not going to get the action you need. So what does this mean for McGill? I think what was interesting over the last day or so is the innovations that you're creating here, which Dr. Larson mentioned, and Dr. Evans has been pursuing, is to bring together other sectors, not the usual culprits, those of us in medicine, but you're bringing in other disciplines like business and law and the social sciences and bringing them together. If you're able to do that, you're going to be able to create innovations that are going to have a value proposition. And I know what you're doing here and creating here will have powerful impacts not only for Montreal, but also for Quebec and the country and the world. Second, you're actually creating some innovative programs in experiential learning. So when you go out and you learn, you can actually do it in the context of providing a service. A few years ago, I was giving a talk to veterinarians. I was walking by the posters, and I saw a dental student there. So what's a dental student doing at a veterinary meeting? So I stopped and I asked her, I said, tell me what you're here for. So she said, thank you. She said, we created a program in Texas of all places. What do? They went in with vet students and went into low-income communities and asked them, do you want your pets cared for? They said yes. So senior vet students went in, and they went into these low-income communities and provided these communities with care for their pets that they never could normally afford. But they didn't go alone. They brought in the senior dental students. And they asked the communities, are you interested in actually getting access to some dental care that they could never afford, right? It's really expensive in the US. And they said yes. So what happened was senior dental students and senior vet students went into low-income communities and gave them benefits that they could never, ever afford to have. A complete win-win situation. Now imagine if it happened here in Montreal and in other low-income communities that exist in and around here. You could get, whether it's dental students or nursing students or those involved in law or medicine, public health, they could go into these communities and provide a service that they would never normally be able to get. It's a win-win situation. Bring in the funders and the politicians, and you have the political support for some big investments into the university that has a social benefit for the community. Second to last, I'll just say that you're invited. Our conference is going to happen in Los Angeles next year, and you always have a great spot, and which we appreciate your presence. We need more Canadian institutions in what we're doing, and we appreciate that McGill has always been a huge presence in our conference and contribute what you're doing, not only to what's happening at our meeting, but you're sharing around the world. So it's an open door. If you're not presenting, if you're presenting, come. If you're not presenting, come anyway. We need you there because we do all kinds of innovative things there which we can talk about. And if there's one last message I want to just share with you, and it's difficult, I think, to do because it involves getting political. You don't need to get partisan, but to quote reference Dr. Rudolf Virchow and Albert Einstein, if we're not involved in politics, we're not going to be impactful. if there's one thing I would just recommend to all of you, at any level, learn the skills that enable you to get engaged. And if you don't know them, it doesn't matter. I got into politics with zero political knowledge. Well, I wouldn't say that, but I didn't take any political science courses. I got involved because I was a doctor who was deeply concerned about the fate of my patients, and about the reason why the patients were coming to my emergency department was for reasons that I had nothing to do with. They were vastly upstream, whether they were those who were addicted or those who stroked because they were mainlining drugs, or those who were in First Nations communities that didn't have any hope, who killed themselves, as teenagers, as groups of teenagers did in my province, right? The reasons why those tragedies happened had nothing to do with a proximate issue. They were issues upstream. And those issues upstream couldn't be dealt by some doctor in BC or any of my colleagues individually. We had to get involved in politics. So you're all doing amazing work. And what I noticed in the posters where I chatted with some of you, the posters you have, a lot of them have significant implications for public policy. Write them up. Write them up in one-pagers, not in big reports, but use the no staple rule. You know what the no staple rule is? If it needs a staple, it's not going to be read, right? Use the no staple rule. And put your work into what you're asking people to do. And be really creative in how you share it. Not only use prose, but use visual means. Use your videos, use your phones, and tell your stories using visual means. Because what moves people, right? Is it what's in this paper, right? It's not it's what's in this paper. It's what you see. It's not only important to affect what goes on in the coconut, right? But it's more important to affect what goes on here. If you create an emotional response, what happens? You remember it. You remember it, others remember it. So learn how to do that. Take a chance. Tell your stories. Be visual. Connect it to the public. Inform the public, and inform the politicians. And together, we'll make a difference. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Martin, for reminding us of the urgency of the climate crisis, but that our actions are not futile, and for inspiring the need to act. I would like now to welcome to the stage Dr. David Malkin, President of Friends of Canadian Institutes of Health Research, who will provide a brief overview of the Friesen Prize and of Friends of CIHR. Please join me in welcoming Dr. David Malkin.
Thanks, Alua, and thank you for allowing us to use this opportunity to present ultimately Dr. Butta and the Friesen Prize. And I just also want to echo the remarks that you just heard with respect to the power of the single paper. My day job, if you will, is as a clinician scientist at the Hospital for Sick Children, University of Toronto, in the field of cancer, pediatric cancer, cancer biology, and genomics. And over the last couple of years, we advocated in two ways. One, with a wonderful survivor, childhood leukemia survivor, who at age 13 tweeted out something that was picked up by the Prime Minister, Minister of Health, and Minister of Finance. That led to a discussion about access to care for children with cancer, which is not that dissimilar to access to care for everybody here, which led to a meeting with several ministers and one of the parliamentary secretaries, which led to a single-page proposal which led to $30 million for creation of the Canadian Pediatric Cancer Consortium, which I have the great honor to direct. And that's how you do change it, and a 13-year-old started that, so I challenge you to do the same. Switching gears entirely, The Friesen Prize and related events are organized by the organization Friends of CIHR, which was created by my predecessor, Dr. Abby Angel, in the early 2000s. And it's a national organization focused on supporting science and society and advocating for, on the behalf of young people, developing careers as scientists or as clinician scientists, and also encouraging enhanced funding for health research in Canada. If I can maybe have the first slide, please. Oh, sorry, okay. There we go, okay. Brochure. Before we hear from Dr. Abuta, who is this year's Friesen Prize laureate, I just want to articulate the process. There's a nominating committee, and nominations come from across the country. In fact, the Friesen Prize over the years, in the last 17 years, has been awarded not only to Canadians doing their work in Canada as leaders in health research, but also those outside the country who've had impact on Canadian science and Canadian health research policy in one form or another. There are multiple sponsors, as you can see on this slide, that are really from all universities and institutions across the country over the years. And the prize winner, as Dr. Buta and I were talking on several Uber rides and taxi rides and so on over the last several days, is quite intense. And in fact, last year's prize winner, Dr. Lauren Terrell, who's at the University of Alberta and developed the first antiviral for hepatitis B, had given 8 lectures over a course of a certain number of months. So I don't want to scare Dr. Buta, but he's on lecture number 3. We're going to cut it a little shorter this year. But on Monday, he spoke in Ottawa, hosted by the University of Ottawa, met with members of Health Canada, Associate Deputy Ministers, discussing some of the most intense and important issues in health care and health research in Canada and globally. And then a dinner in the evening where the prize was essentially awarded, attended by MPs, senators, High Commissioner of Pakistan, and others. And then the next day, or actually yesterday rather, in Toronto, where he gave a similar lecture at the Hospital for Sick Children. But one of the events that's very important to the Friesen Prize is actually what we, these are today's obviously, is what we call the round tables, policy round tables. And these are opportunities for the prize winner to sit with faculty, but importantly also with several trainees, similar to the session this afternoon, to really open up and discuss some of the key issues that trainees are working on, are interested in the field of that particular laureate. You've heard already a little bit about Dr. Friesen. He is still doing well, very active in Winnipeg, his hometown in Manitoba, and expressed his regrets for not being able to attend the events this year. But he is absolutely a key element still in his 90th year on the activities of health research in Canada, and still has an influential voice in that regard. He did create CIHR, the 4 pillars of research. In the early 2000s, was very involved in the Medical Research Council of Canada that predated this. So the prize winners transcribe, if you will, the lecture, and a book is created every second year. And as you can see, one of your past McGill honorees was Professor Bartha Knoppers in law and ethics, and they were similarly will be awarded. As I mentioned, the round tables cover many, many areas of research and health policy, depending on what the prize winners' areas of expertise are. So I will leave it with that. Thank you again. Thank you to McGill for honoring Dr. Buta this year, and for engaging the Friends of CIHR, and especially honoring really a pioneer in Canadian health research, Dr. Henry Friesen. Thank you.
you very much, Dr. Malkin, for all that information, but especially for reminding us of the big change that we can make with something as small as a tweet, but most importantly, by sharing our vision of the future and what we deem an important message. So thank you. And now it is my honor to introduce our distinguished keynote speaker, Dr. Zulfikar Bhutta, the recipient of the 2023 Henry G. Friesen International Prize in Health Research. Now, I'm going to present a little bit of an introduction and more information about Dr. Bhutta. I'll make it as quick as possible. Dr. Bhutta is a globally renowned expert in health research, serving as a distinguished university professor and founding director of the Institute for Global Health and Development and the Center of Excellence in Women and Child Health at the Aga Khan University. He also holds the Robert Harding Inaugural Chair in Global Child Health and the Hospital for Sick Children in Toronto, and is the co-director of the Sick Kids Center for Global Child Health. His remarkable career spans various roles, including representing global academic and research organizations on the Gavi board, being a member of the Independent Expert Review Group appointed by the UN Secretary General, and contributing to the WHO's Maternal and Child Health Oversight Committee. His influential work on the first 1,000 days of life has left a significant impact on global health and my own understanding of maternal global health inequalities. His accomplishments have earned him numerous awards, including the Canada 150 Medal, recognition by the National Academy of Medicine, election as a Fellow of the Royal Society. Notably, he is awarded the Rue Prize in 2021 and the John Dirks Canada Gardner Global Health Award in 2022. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Dr. Zulfikar Bhutta, a leading figure.
Well, thank you very much for that generous introduction and also for the invitation to be here amongst you. I have to tell you, when David called me and told me about the Friesen Prize, he told me nothing about the 8 lectures and all the other activities that we've been engaged in this last week. But it's been a real pleasure to share those rides and that experience and the last few days with you, David. And I'm particularly thrilled to be here at McGill with my friend Tim and Charles and many other colleagues that I've respected in global health over the last several years and decades. So I didn't want to bring you another clone of what I've been talking about the last few days on the future of global maternal and child health, but I thought instead of speaking to you about the whole issue of why does climate change matter to maternal and child health, particularly from a lens of low and middle income countries. And to do this, I had no idea when I planned this that I would follow Keith, who would do such a fantastic job of talking about mitigation, what needs to happen in the bigger picture. So what I'll do over the next 35 minutes is to talk to you about what is the overall evidence on climate change and health from low and middle income countries in particular. I'm going to touch on the issue of complexity and polycrises. What evidence do we have that it really matters for women and children, and particularly maternal and child health? And then importantly, I'm going to perhaps give you an inkling of what we are trying to do ourselves for addressing this in low and middle income countries. Not through the loss and damage fund that was set up in COP27, and as Keith alluded to, has received zero money in the last 1 year, but on things that can make a difference on the ground, and largely coming from not old fogies like myself, but from young people who bring ideas and innovations and are actually trying to do something in low and middle income countries. So to the naysayers, and there are hopefully fewer naysayers in 2023 than there were just a few years ago, climate change is a reality. This is no longer an issue that should be debated. And every now and then, you hear something and read something in the press. But I want to point out that one of the persons who actually blew the alarm bell on this several decades ago has just published, Jim Hansen has just published an update of his predictive modeling on global warming. And if anything, it tells that this has now become a global emergency. This last year alone is on track to be the hottest year on record. And if you look at principally where global temperatures have soared to figures that we have not really believed or imagined, it is not just low and middle income countries. In this particular country, you have seen the consequences of climate change in terms of the environment, the wildfires that have engulfed both sides of our geography. But few people recognize that it's not just heating that is impacting the world. It's also the impact that it has had on things like precipitation. So if you were to draw a map on where are we beginning to see excess precipitation following climate change, you'll find that it's some of the same geographies. Africa, South Asia, where we are beginning to see patterns that have completely changed. In 2022, in South Asia, in my own home country of Pakistan, where I do a lot of my work, not only did we have some of the hottest weeks on record with average temperatures in excess of 45 degrees centigrade for weeks on end. And remember, it's not just the peak temperature, it's also the diurnal variation, the difference between the day and night temperature. When you have very little diurnal variation, that means people have to kind of live, work, sleep in an environmental temperature that has hardly budged. And that lasted for weeks. This year, Arizona experienced that for a period of 6 weeks on a trot. But last year in Pakistan, not only was that one of the hottest time periods on record in the south of the country, but it was also accompanied by biblical floods. The biblical floods did not come from the meltdown of the glaciers in the north of the country. They came because the monsoon pattern changed completely. People were caught unawares because the weather system entered from Rajasthan, from a part of the region where it has never been seen before. And as a result, therefore, people did not have time to prepare. And the consequences of this disaster related to climate in Pakistan was enormous. More than 30 million people were affected, of which half were children. Of the deaths that were recorded in the first month after the disaster, a third were children. And you just have to count the infrastructure damage. We estimated, although people debated it around rounding off of the figures, that between $25 and $30 billion were lost to the economy. And for a poor country, which then subsequently took a year and a half to negotiate a $3 billion loan from the IMF, not even a grant, a loan, succeeded in getting the COP27 to agree on a loss and damage fund and received not a single dime. You can imagine how climate change can bankrupt a country. And I've seen this in my own, with my own eyes. So this is not trivial, ladies and gentlemen. And climate change and its impact on populations has to be considered in the context of its consequences that may be way beyond climate itself. And that's one of the reasons why we say that this is a threat multiplier. And particularly in the context of geographies where this is going to cluster, it escalates social, political, economic tensions and is often an underlying factor in conflict. How many people in the audience know the genesis of the Darfur conflict in Sudan? Very few people recognize that it was a conflict related to sharing of water resources, underground water. And if you look at the history of the genesis of the Syria conflict, it started basically also by water restriction on a city. So climate change impacts socioeconomic drivers, determinants, and consequences in a way that we have not really begun to appreciate before. And my group tried to look at this from a very simple elementary calculation. So I'm going to show you some of the figures around these so-called 4 Cs, the polycrisis that everybody talks about. So if you just look at where the global burden of climate change is largely clustered, it's Africa and South Asia where we see the maximum burden of this in numeric terms. If you were to overlay on this map, the map of current and recent conflicts, there is almost complete homology. And you can understand why these conflicts impact the Horn of Africa, the Afpak region, and parts of Northern Africa. Now you look at where there is pandemic susceptibility because health systems are not strong and non-existent. You find that these are the same geographies with the weakest health systems. We were talking a little bit about COVID-19 over lunch today, and some of the least data, when you go to the modelers and demographers, they tell you how little COVID-19 was in these very areas which are insecure, conflict, or affected by social upheaval. Well, hardly surprising, because there was hardly any diagnostic testing in that. Well, that doesn't mean that it didn't exist. And those susceptibilities are certainly there. And then you add to the mix cost of living crises or the economic crisis that the world witnessed after COVID-19, triggered maybe by conflicts, Ukraine, and the run on currencies, and you begin to see the picture. There is the same similar comparable neighboring geographies where these 4 C's are clustered. So we did this very simple elementary exercise of just putting the numbers together to estimate which are the countries that are facing all of these crises at the same time. And then we tried to see, okay, where is the current global burden of mortality, morbidity, and many other factors clustered? So you take these geographies and you find some of these countries are where currently we are facing the greatest crises of maternal and child mortality. And in numeric terms, these 13 countries alone that you see here with polycrisis, and they're not the only countries, this is just the top 13 countries which have a score of 8 or more on our numbers, have almost 44% of the burden of global maternal mortality and around 1/3 of the burden of child mortality by current numbers. And they have close to around 40% of the burden of undernutrition. So you've got to recognize that these climate changes and risks are increasingly being seen in the context of geographies where countries' abilities to react, respond, or work on mitigation, carbon footprint reduction, and investments in moving to renewable energies or reduction in the use of fossil fuels is going to be very limited. We've actually done the estimation of what will it cost to change from the current energy system in Pakistan to the use of solar energy. And the bottom line is that the government will have to cough out $3 billion to do that for the entire population. And I just told you how much did the IMF give Pakistan as a loan after 2 years of negotiation. So then we are going to impose import tariffs on countries to pay a surcharge if you don't invest in this. And once again, the burden and the cost of climate-related strategies is going to fall disproportionately on the shoulders of low and middle-income countries who do not have the capacity at this point in time to react to this the same way. Okay, so let's now move on to what do we know about climate change and its impact on health. And very interestingly, we've had 27 COPs. This is the 28th COP. How many of those 27 COPs have had health on their agenda? Zip. This is the first time that health is on the agenda of COP28. And everybody's celebrating this. But some of us would like to see this absolutely translate into action and resources on the ground. So the climate change impacts human health in a variety of ways. It does through both CO2 level change and the change in the environment and the impact of both extreme heat precipitation, the impact on food systems and agriculture. So we recognize the complexity of the broad environment and the way health will relate to climate change. But the IPCC put out a graphic, which was then modified by the Lancet Countdown Commission for Climate, which I do want to show. And the important thing here is not to look at all of these arrows and where they go, but to recognize that the direct and indirect effects of climate change are modulated and magnified in many places by the social dynamics of what you change, by what exists already. The whole issue of age, gender, socioeconomic gradients, social capital, the ability of people to respond, the ability of social safety nets in a country to protect the farmers, to provide them the insurance that they would need for crops that are destroyed and basically lead to change in livelihoods and things. The consequences of climate change are modulated by the social drivers that exist in a particular circumstance. And some of these adverse effects are not recognizable by the acute effects of climate. So the point that needs to be driven home is that climate, and particularly heat, increasing heat, exerts impact on human health, and particularly in the context of maternal child health, to subtle effects that may actually start even before the birth of the child. So we're beginning to recognize the impact of climate on the pregnancy period, on the pre-pregnancy period, on the whole issue of epigenetic influences, and these things have an intergenerational effect through the life course. And this was not on the radar screen of either governments or scientists until very recently. My friend and collaborator Anna Bonnell did this work in the Gambia, looking at answering the simple question: is the exposure of pregnant women to excess heat in the environment greater, and are the consequences greater than what you see in non-pregnant women in the same environment? And as you can see over here, that she was able to demonstrate that women get exposed to not only the effect of climate, but their metabolic and physiological changes in pregnancy are also exaggerated in the same way. The consequences we recognize from the epidemiological data that was already available on the relationship of heat, variability, and outcomes like low birth weight. But much of this data comes from high-income countries. And it is a little bit of a surprise for me that people have not picked on this before. This is a study largely of fetal growth between 9 and 26 weeks of gestation from high-income countries, Europe and North America. And as you can see, that you begin to see an impact in terms of relationship, of adverse outcomes, particularly low birth weight, the greater the exposure, and particularly the more severe the exposure over time. You also look at other maternal and newborn health indicators, and in this particular systematic review by my colleague Matthew Chersich, he has looked at the effect of extreme heat on outcomes such as compromised placental function and also impacts on preterm birth rates, something that, Michael, you know about more than anybody else, and per degree increase in temperature. But look at most of these studies. These are studies that have been done in high-income settings. We are beginning to get some data from low middle-income settings as well. This is 14 low and middle-income country data, which is principally longitudinal data, on the impact of exposure, again, and reduction in diurnal temperature, as well as maximal temperature, on impact on both prematurity and stillbirths. And you can see the direction of effect. Now, we are not very clear at this stage as to how this happens, because the epidemiological data, limited as it is unclear whether this impact is greater if you have exposure early in pregnancy as compared to later in pregnancy. And it appears, at least from the limited data sets that we have, that the impact on prematurity may be greater if the exposure is later in pregnancy, which makes sense in terms of some of the physiological permutations that take place. Now, recently, from our own institution, there's been a very interesting study. It was a fortuitous study because it was part of a randomized controlled trial of looking at a nutrition intervention in women, where we were trying to see if nutrition interventions would make a difference to birth outcomes. And as part of this, data was available that was eventually collated by Nancy Krebs and Karthik Shankar in terms of how much was the exposure at various stages of pregnancy to extreme heat. And extreme heat here was defined as a Tmax, or exposure to 39 degrees centigrade or above, for several successive days. And this was then correlated with whether that exposure was in early pregnancy and in later pregnancy. There's a ton of information in this particular paper, but I just want to summarize two things. One is that if you look at growth, fetal growth, as just an outcome, you see very interestingly that for fetuses that were exposed to extreme heat, in early pregnancy. And extreme heat defined here as days above 39 degrees centigrade. Which, by the way, I don't think is extreme heat, but people call it extreme heat. But you look at those, and these were fetuses or babies who were born with lower length for HZ score, and also importantly, smaller head circumferences. Massive. And Karthik was also able to analyze some of the biospecimens available in terms of which genes were upregulated. And all of this is associational data, but there were indications that this heat exposure was also associated with upregulation of many inflammatory genes and genes associated with the risks of preeclampsia and others. Very early stage, inexact, but a pointer as to where things might be going. So I do want to spend a few minutes on the interconnections of health, nutrition, and climate change through what we know and highlight what we don't know. So we know that climate impacts agriculture, food production, food security, and the entire food system in a way that relates to just the quantity of food and what may be available on the table. But very few people recognize that the impacts of climate, extreme heat, on agriculture is both quantitative and qualitative. So on the quantitative side, very clear that if you have extreme heat effects, irrespective of whether you have reduction in soil water, and if you have both, the impact is much greater. But just the fact that you have extreme heat leads to an adaptive change and a reduction in crop production. And this is data from California, and I can show you data from elsewhere in low and middle income countries where such an impact on production of staple crops is even exaggerated. What we also know is that increased CO2 concentration, and particularly compounded by increased heat, reduces the micronutrient concentration within crops. Why that happens is not very clear. It could be an adaptive strategy by the crops themselves or plants to somehow or the other restrict their growth and conserve things given the supply of nutrients available. But the end product is that the crops that you get are lower in the content of many key micronutrients that are important for human health: zinc, iron, and so forth. And to many farmers in the field, and I've seen this because we are working with biofortified zinc wheat at the moment, they recognize how not only does the yield go down, but the wheat quality goes down. There has been some indirect indicator on the impact of extreme heat and nutrition parameters from Africa. Not exact, as I said, modeling studies suggested that an increase in temperature would increase the prevalence of stunting by certain percentage, 7%. Largely model data, never had real data here. More recently, my group has looked at this in great detail, taking advantage of data that we have from 2 sequential nutrition surveys in Pakistan that were done at district level. So if you take, for example, the burden of maternal malnutrition in Pakistan, you can see that there is a north to the south gradient. It's largely concentrated in the south. Same with wasting and stunting. So it's not a universal phenomena. There's a north to south gradient. So we were very interested in looking at what is the relationship of climate, heat, for example, and water security on some of these parameters. And it took us a bit of time, over 2 years, for us to assemble the data from remote sensing information on what had happened to changes in average annual temperature at these district levels, what had happened to precipitation, and importantly, volumetric soil water concentration. So we had that data set to see what could be related in that nutrition survey to actually what was happening at those ecological levels. And when you do a multivariate analysis as to what relates to linear growth in children, length for HZ score, and see what drives it, what do we find? We find that there's absolutely things that we expect to happen, like improvements in economics, maternal education, food security, living in an urban area. All of them are associated with improved linear growth in children and reduced rates of stunting over time. But you also see the negative effect independent in the same multivariate model of both increase in temperature and also reduction in soil water. So clearly to us in Pakistan, This is a major driver of linear growth retardation in children. It's probably been operating for a very long time and unrecognized. And whether it happens through fetal growth retardation or early exposures of young infants to the effects of extreme heat and its impact on metabolism remains to be seen. But let me just talk about something that, again, came up in several posters today, is the impact that climate may have on mental health. And while this was recognized to be actually the case with more than 3 times the risks amongst people with mental health disorders, but what was not very clear is how the age distribution of some of these things are. So Andy Haynes shared the slide with me, which actually talks about climate anxiety and what is now beginning to be recognized as solastalgia, which is absolutely prevalent in young people. Why? Because climate change to them is their future. And if you go and ask young people, adolescents, and many of those surveys, this uncertainty as to what the planet holds for them is behind many of the anxiety disorders that these young people feel. Do I have 10 minutes left, or is that? Oh, that's plenty of time. Okay. So let me change gears and talk about what can be done. And I'm not going to talk about mitigation because there's plenty written on it. I'm going to talk about things that can be done with resources that we have in the populations that we have. So IPCC will give us all of these models of how can we adapt and make change. And what it basically says is for a range of climate-related environmental issues, the potential for adaptation to reduce risk is quite significant. And we could reduce things by 20, 30%, but it's all model data. They don't tell you how to do it. So we were very interested in looking at the global evidence around what works, particularly in difficult circumstances. And we started off by looking at what's available from high-income settings on adaptation and resilience to improve population responses to the effect of climate change, particularly heat. So if you take, Canada, for example, there are things, anecdotal, some of them are formal evaluations, and some of them are less so, case studies. But there is evidence of things that work here. For example, urban forestry, reflective and permeable pavements. But these are things that poor countries can hardly afford. And there are no pavements in rural areas. There are no pavements in many of the cities either. So we undertook a systematic analysis with funding from IDRC. We developed a gap map last year, which has since then been updated. And that gap map tried to look at what evidence was available on reviews from various settings, including middle income and low income settings, to look at associations between climate change, hazards, and health outcomes. So this traffic light tells you that for certain areas, there was virtually nothing. So on the x-axis are the types of climate change hazards. Another y-axis on the horizontal, are things that relate to various outcomes. And what you can see here is that for various things that I thought there would be tons of evidence, virtually nothing on occupational hazards and injuries in low and middle income countries. There's some stuff on pregnancy and birth outcomes, but you will also notice that for many things that we know are there, like wildfires, particulate matters, the number of reviews that have looked at this with low and middle income countries included are just limited. And then you go to adaptation, mitigation responses, and climate change strategies from low and middle income countries, whether they are behavioral, ecosystem, technology, or institutional strategies, and you hardly have one or two or none. So the bottom line is there's very little evidence available as to what can work. And the Lancet Climate Commission and some of its offshoots did come up with a framework as to what could be done in population settings, read community settings, to help make things different, to help promote resilience and adaptation. But none of these came out of a solid background of evidence as to what would work. So we have recently completed a systematic review of a range of strategies that are possible in low and middle income countries for which there is some evidence of benefits, even though observational, and a few trials that are there. And I'm going to go through those with you one by one. So let's start and look at structural innovations. And the biggest structural innovation for climate change that the World Health Organization would have us believe are those within the health system. So the interventions that are proposed for structural innovations in health system to promote resilience include access to funds. We all know where that is. So the Green Climate Fund, for example, has to date given virtually less than 5% of its resources to low and middle income countries for adaptation and resilience. So I don't know where WHO is living at the moment. Training health workers in climate change will also require resources, but I agree that that is absolutely important, and particularly the right kind of climate change training for the right kind of health workers. Surveillance systems for climate, which means translating the meteorological information that's available at any kind of a level into local action. People in Europe knew what was going to happen with the extreme weather events in Libya. They knew that there was a major torrential storm coming, which would overcome the capacity of the dams that were right north of the city and what was going to happen. But that transfer of information to the country to be able to make an adaptation only took place 2 days after the event. So our global early warning systems are also not linked. And over 10,000 people died when those 2 dams were breached in Libya just a few months ago. So these surveillance systems exist in theory. They need to be translated into practice. And then, of course, health facilities I've already spoken about. What will it take to make carbon neutral health facilities? All of this technology and change will require resources not only for first-time installation, but also maintenance and replacement. And remember, most low and middle income countries do not manufacture solar panels. The cheapest solar panels that are available in the world are from China, and I've just given you the dollar figure of what it will take to just replace health facilities in one country with solar panels. So there are other things that can be done. And they can be done in the kind of populations that I'm talking about with extreme heat events like urban slums, where, as you can see, most people have tin roofs, and these tin roofs become like incubators during the summer. Everyone in this audience would know about why you don't leave a child in a car park in the middle of the summer. Why? Because the inside temperature increases much greater than what the environmental temperature is. Same is what happens in a dwelling like this if you have a tin roof with no windows. When this first happened in Pakistan, the heat event 8 years ago, 1,600 people died in urban slums because people were not aware of what was going to happen. Now, there are solutions. Some of those solutions are reasonable, reflective paints. You could put those in place, and you could also do that at low cost. And there are many examples now emerging from South Asia, particularly from large urban populations, of innovations at population level to do this. There's been a trial and evaluation in Ahmedabad in India where it shows that if you were to do that, and particularly correlate that with technology, that you could reduce the environmental temperature within those dwellings quite significantly. So, possibility there. My own group is working in rural populations on trying to see what can be done by greening plantations. And one of the areas that we are working in now with funding from the Wellcome Trust is to create these shelters in rural populations where people can actually wait under a shade for a vehicle. And these could also be early warning or monitoring stations. There is work already done by people outside of the health sector. The architects and engineers are ahead of the game right now. This is Yasmin Lari from Pakistan, who's built this prototype climate-resistant and flood-resistant household. And some of these are being constructed right now at scale in rural areas at a cost that is less than this dwelling is at a cost of less than $300. This is what is being done post-floods to build some climate-friendly and flood-resistant structures that can be over there. But I want to take a minute or so to talk about the other structural innovations and interventions. I want to particularly talk about gender issues. Climate change, like poverty, has often got a girl's and a woman's face. Why? Because they don't have the same ability in many systems to adapt or to change their routine like men do. When I was living in Karachi, and I would go for my morning workout at daybreak, I would see, when it was dark, a long line of workers who were going out to find work every day, and I would ask myself, why are they going so early when it's dark? The reason why they were going out in the peak of the summer at that period of point in time was because they would then finish their work by midday. They were put in a whole day's work when it was still cool. Women don't have that ability to change their routines. They have the job and the task to bring in water, fuel, and also they can't go out when it's dark because of social restrictions, and they can't change their dress code the same way in many areas like men can. So we are experimenting at this stage, working with communities to see if men could take greater responsibility for some of these tasks in rural areas to reduce the exposure and risks that many women have, particularly when they are pregnant. And this, addressing some of the gender dimensions of heat risk exposure, requires community mobilization, working with community health workers, community support groups, also developing climate-friendly health services that are willing to innovate and experiment with things like group antenatal care, group transport systems. Why do women have to go individually for care to hospital, ambulatory care, when they can do that in a group at a time when they don't have the same level of exposure? And my favorite area of intervention is building environmental friendly and safe schools for girls. And some of this is being done as we speak. This is an award-winning school which has been built in a climate-friendly manner for girls, and this has been built in rural Rajasthan, and is a model of what needs to happen. Now, I don't have time to go through every intervention, but I want to finish by just talking about mental health. And we recognize full well the impact of mental health and the need for strategies as a consequence of climate change. And the good news here is that we have strategies that work. This is a systematic review of interventions done in low middle income settings following a range of climate crises and disasters. And you will notice, without reading the small print that you can't see from the back, the direction of the diamonds. That in almost all instances, benefit has been shown from mental health outreach and strategies. And certainly in Pakistan, this has been done through technology and applications. So ladies and gentlemen, let me finish by saying that there is a way forward. And the way forward is firstly that we need to generate much better high quality data on climate change and its impact on women and children, which represent such a large chunk of the population. And next month in Toronto, we will have our symposium and workshop on trying to develop some of these research priorities supported by CIHR and IDRC. And that the diverse set of health concerns that modulate the impact of climate change, pre-existing malnutrition, gender inequities, are things that we need to be extremely concerned about at this stage as we develop strategies for action. And all of this has to be done at low cost. So I don't believe that we are going to be able to implement any of the proposed high cost strategies that are being talked about through technology solutions in the medium to short term. And therefore, I'm going to do, certainly my group is going to do what we did in the MDG period and SDE period, is go back to the basics of working with populations, communities, and developing low-cost solutions that communities can scale up. And this needs to also focus on geographies which are not easy. They are difficult. They have polycrises, but they need it now. Thank you very much for your attention.
So thank you so much, Dr. Bhutta, for delivering such a thought-provoking presentation that really sparked deep reflection, and also for showing us that there is some light at the end of the tunnel with the solutions you've shared. So we will now transition into the moderated Q&A session, but with both of our keynote speakers. Thank you, everybody. I'm supposed to welcome everyone, but I'm so glad that everyone is seated. I'm just going to give some information on 2 new members. So we have here Dr. Jill Baumgartner here, wearing pink. She's an associate professor in the Department of Equity, Ethics, and Policy, as well as the Department of Epidemiology, Biostatistics, and Occupational Health. And we're also joined by Ms. Emma Buajiti, who is a PhD candidate in epidemiology and a Vanier Scholar. So please welcome everyone, and yes, thank you so much.
Great, so hopefully this is on, it is. Emma is going to be looking out for questions that come in online. So for people who are attending remotely, please do submit your questions. And we're gonna open up the mics for people that have questions that they wanna ask our speakers. Great, can you come up to the mic, please? Yes, please, thank you, just so the people online can hear as well.
So my question in particular is to Dr. Martin, and I want to draw upon your experience in Parliament and ask that when addressing climate change, it's a number of times it's also the MNCs and corporations that run most of, the enterprises that produce a lot of the greenhouse gas emissions and the damage that climate change is usually associated with. And they also command a lot of sway in terms of financial power and maybe control, and also controlling the media. So how is it that, or rather, who outweighs who in this grand game of addressing climate change effectively? Is it the government that can affect more change, or is it the corporates, or do both of them have to work together? And how does that happen?
Well, you hit the nub of the matter, right? You put your finger on the politics of it, right? Because the private sector is not going to do this out of the goodness of their heart, right? Their goal is to increase shareholder value and to make money, right? It's magical thinking to think that they're going to come up and say, oh, human rights and equity, we're going to do that. No, they're not. And the proof is what has actually happened, right? So governments need to actually make the policies that are evidence-based that will do what is necessary for the public good, which is what their role is. But what we have to do is to give, as I mentioned in my talk, that the forces right now are allied in favor of the private sector, right? But the governments are doing with the private sector because what drives political action is to speak to the incentives of politicians, which is to get elected. And what drives them is what are the needs of their voter at the dinner table, which is, do you have a job? How much money do you have in your pocket? Do you have a better future for your kids? Right? So what we have to do, I believe, is give to the politicians at different levels, because it's not only at a national level, but it's actually at a state level and also at cities. A lot of the climate change action can and is happening at a city level. So what our job is taking a multi-pronged approach at different levels is to give to the politicians what is necessary for them to create jobs, to be able to have economic benefits, and there's a lot of things we can do. And then the other part is we've got to inform the public, because the public can move the political. And the third arm, you're right, is the media, which is tough because of the fractured nature of media and how people are getting their information. And that's where we generally don't do a good job of communicating our work because we put things in journals, right? But that needs to be translated into visual means that, as I mentioned, affects this, but more importantly affects this. And if we're clever about doing that, building partnerships, we can build a political movement that gives a stronger political argument to what we want to do. Thanks.
So other questions? Maybe I can follow up on that. So I think in your example on carbon capture, one of the big challenges, right, is that for putting money into carbon capture, as you were saying. We're basically saying, okay, all of these oil companies, right, they've created a mess, we're gonna give them a bunch of money and they can mop it up, right? And it's going right back into the same pockets of the people that were polluting. And I think the challenge is that, Zulfi, when you were giving your talk, at the end, these are interventions that like impact real people, right? These are things that are gonna make a difference in people's lives. So how do we shift this funding? How do we shift it from going back into the pockets of the same people who are, polluting and creating the problems, and give it to communities, like places where this is actually going to have, tangible benefits for people that are in some of the most vulnerable places in the world, or the most vulnerable places in Canada as well. And I guess it's a question to both of you.
So maybe I can take a crack at this. So I waited 2 years, Jill, as you and I have discussed before, in my own geography, and both in Kenya and in Pakistan, to see how much would the private sector put into climate adaptation and resilience strategies. And after 2 years, I decided to pivot and not wait for the money, but to proceed with things that we could do today with the resources available, particularly human resource available, and things that district-level health systems might be able to reprogram and include. And that includes existing strategies, number one, to include climate adaptation and resilience building within existing MNCH curricula. So these are community health workers out there. It will take very little to include an awareness of the impact of heat and pregnancy, changes in lifestyle, workload, protection, as I mentioned, innovations around how do you ask people to come in the middle of the summer for antenatal care. And a lot of that was also informed by experience during COVID. During COVID, because we recognize people are not going to be able to move with all the stringent measures in place, so what did people do? They changed all the strategies around antenatal care, gave people 3 months supplies rather than asking them to come back every month, and also clubbed many of those interventions together, changed work schedules. So I think there is a lot that can be done with innovation, using community-based strategies, and using innovations that will come from civic society. Now, I think it will require resources, but I don't think those resources are going to come from the Shell or the petroleum conglomerates that have made a killing over the last few years, both in the wake of the Ukraine crisis and others. I think they are going to come from philanthropy and community-based, within-country approaches that you might have from other sources. When you come in November, at the end of this month, come and see for yourself as to how civic society is beginning to respond to this, and is more than willing to put things in place to reduce some of the impacts. Even before women and children, people are aware of the risks to the elderly and the most vulnerable in the community. So I'll just finish by using an example. I told you 8 years ago when we had the heat dome effect in Karachi, the crisis, 1,600 people died in that 24-hour period. 2 years ago, we had a similar phenomena, and there were only 2 deaths. Partly it was because the government was better prepared, the hospitals were better prepared, but more importantly, the communities were better prepared. Through volunteers, through systems of people who went and found where the most vulnerable were, making sure there was enough water to hydrate people, and to find out if there was somebody in need, an elderly person in a household who would have nobody to take him or her out. So those community-based innovations and approaches, I think, have much greater potential for at least some degree of resilience and adaptation at this stage without waiting for the cops to deliver.
So who's paying, right? Where's the money coming from? Well, the first thing is we know in medicine is our guiding principle is what? Do no harm. Do no harm. We're doing harm right now because of the billions and billions of dollars of subsidies that go into oil-producing companies, gas and oil exploration, right? Billions of dollars. So the first thing is stop the subsidies, cut them out. Transfer those subsidies over to the green innovations that we know can actually impact climate change. Second, on carbon capture. You're referring to exactly, right? There's, as I mentioned in my talk, there's expensive and complicated or cheap and simple. Let's go with cheap and simple. don't invest in the expensive technological climate capture that needs to a lot more investment, why don't you go with what we already know? Go with protecting the green spaces which are carbon sinks, which are being decimated right now, whether it's up in our boreal forest or in those biodiverse hotspots. And that's important for the communities that Zulfi works with, because those communities, and it's just check out the International Union for the Conservation of Nature. Check out, just Google sometime biodiverse hotspots. Check out what the UN Environment Program has done, which is awesome work in showing how those biodiverse hotspots can be actually used sustainably, and those monies can be invested into health, into education, into water, into sanitation. It can be done. I spent a lot of time in the bush in Southern Africa working with game rangers on anti-poaching patrols. It's an interest of mine, working on conservation. But what they would do is they would take me into their communities. And what they would do is, after we did our patrols, they would take me into the communities and show me the impoverished environments that their communities lived in. They also showed me conservation areas that were generating billions of dollars. Now, the African Union has shown really clearly that biodiverse hotspots can generate billions of dollars and millions of jobs if it's used sustainably. What doesn't happen is that the revenues from those conservation areas are generally not shared with the communities. That's an opportunity. That's a political choice. You can construct your economic arrangements so that those conservation areas can generate billions of dollars, millions of jobs, and it can be driven in to the actual programs that we're talking about here to improve the social determinants of health. So it's a win-win situation, and it also deals with that biodiversity crisis that is important for food security, disease transmission rates, migration issues. So those are just kind of some of the issues. And then finally, carbon tax and tax shifting. All are solutions that are known, but they're political choices. And that will address your question, right? And then the government's making that decision because they have a responsibility to do that. But we have to push that with them and tell them why they need to do it and the cost of inaction, which is considerable and is largely unrecognized.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much for the presentation. Yeah, this is on. I have two questions. The first one is around how do we make the climate change crisis urgent for the everyday person? Because in our day-to-day lives, even for me, I'm not thinking about climate change every single day, right? And even trying to convince some of my friends and family and people that I meet that this is urgent, this is a crisis, we need to act right now. How do we make it relatable to an everyday person? That's the first question. And then the second question is, when I was looking at the graphs that you showed, most of the effects are happening in low and middle income countries in Africa. I'm from Zimbabwe. Our priorities right now are not really focused on climate change. That seems so far in the future, right? We have other urgent things that about strengthening our own economy, making sure our education system is right, our healthcare system is working. So how do we put the climate change crisis also on the table so that we start thinking about this and making the necessary changes right now?
So it depends upon where you are, but I can tell you in parts of the world where certainly the climate change crisis is acute with extreme heat, people don't have to be reminded of climate change. I mean, they see it in front of their eyes and see the consequences of it, particularly as Keith was pointing out. I mean, climate change is one of the biggest drivers of migration, particularly if people cannot grow crops, they cannot earn a livelihood. I mean, that's one of the reasons why we need to start with where the issues are extreme. And I think picking some of these hotspots where climate change is extreme as where interventions need to go is important. And it's not the same all over the country in the same way. If you saw from my maps of Pakistan, it's a problem in the south and the middle of the country where this is a big issue. Now, it's true, the climate change burden is going to be highest in some of these 4C countries or countries that you saw in Africa and parts of South Asia. That's what we know from the data. in many places, unless, as I said, you have an extreme heat event or some of the crises that you get from floods and disasters, this is not something that governments know about intuitively, but they can be told. And the tide is shifting here. I mean, there is now greater awareness of the relationship of climate change with economic losses and development. I gave you the one real life example. In one stroke, a country loses $30 billion of its infrastructure investment. 16,000 schools were destroyed within a period of a few weeks. So that kind of information and warning, whether it's Zimbabwe or whether it's Kenya, north part of Kenya or elsewhere, those are real hard data that politicians need to be aware of. Well, what do you think, Ian?
Oh, thanks, Louis. So, great question. Low-income countries are not producing the problem, but they're paying the price, right? Zim's paying the price. Pakistan's paying the price. Bangladesh, it's estimated, a new study came out, that Bangladesh will disappear by 2050 at the current rate of global warming. That's beyond that. Well, there's no words to put to that, right? So it's those 20 countries. The interesting thing about it is we get together in this effort, in some global effort to make a decision, but it's not the world that's producing it. It's those 20 countries that produce 80%, 75 to 80% of greenhouse gas emissions. So that's the target. So what can you do? It's this kind of an interesting, because I mentioned this is really the status quo and those COPs, right? There's incentives to game the system, right? To say you're going to do something, go home and don't do it. But the public pressure has to go on to those 20 countries for them to come together to reduce their emissions congruent with a 50% reduction by 2030 if we're going to have a chance of bending the curve to below 2 degrees centigrade increase. And how do you do that? Well, amongst those 20 countries, you have to have a system of enforcement and penalties, and that can come through tariff imports, right? If you're making your targets, you get tariff benefits. If you're not, you're penalized. So it's going to hurt you economically. So there's an incentive to be able to act because those economic penalties will affect your bottom line and your voter, which they don't want. So that way you connect the action to what matters at the dinner table. And it's not the dinner table in Harare, it's the dinner table in New York and in Toronto and in Montreal, right? It's in our dinner tables here. So that's how we can actually connect action to effective impact to address the target of the 50% reduction by 2030.
Great. So I think we are at the end of our Q&A session. It was brief. Thank you. If it is this is not me, it's him. It must be a short question.
Very short. Christina from Friends of CIHR and the Friesen Prize program. Merci beaucoup à l'Université de McGill pour cette conférence extraordinaire. Dr. Zulfikar Bhutta, just looking back at your examples of the biblical floods in Pakistan, the effects of extreme heat on pregnant women, wasting and stunting in children. Some people may be indifferent to the whole thing. How would you convince Canadians that our country will pay the price and that these aren't problems that just exist in some other country? How would you make us wake up?
How would I speak to Canadians for investing in climate change? Because some of those impacts will be seen in Canada also. I haven't spoken about many things that happened with climate change in Canada, like, for example, the effect of wildfire. In the interest of time, I have to cut out stuff looking at, for example, what does environmental air pollution, you should ask Jill that, does on the health of women and children, and we haven't even begun to scratch the surface of what that does here. We haven't even begun to look at the combined effect of heat as well as environmental pollution, and I can guarantee you that it's not going to be additive, it's probably going to be multiplicative. So, as I was telling people earlier today, the one thing about climate change and environmental impacts of climate change are that they don't need passports or nationalities to influence the globe. That we see these effects of whether it's El Niños and others across the world. If the current patterns in the Atlantic changes, who do you think will be impacted by that? People in the northern hemisphere, much before it impacts, the west of Africa. So I think what we realize from climate change is that the issues and challenges are universal. And there is no us versus them. This may be apparent today because the impacts are much greater in certain geographies than others, but down the road it will impact everybody. We only have one planet. Only one planet. And climate change, we may have the watches, but climate change has time. And people have to recognize that what we need to do for climate change today is an emergency. Why? Because we will reach a tipping point after which it will be very difficult to reverse things. So it's not just a question of Canada, it's a question of the globe.
So I just want to thank both of our speakers. Thanks to Emma for monitoring the online questions that came in. Thanks to everyone who asked their questions, and for reminding us that I think climate change, in some ways, environment, climate, it separates us from that. But this is essentially a problem of civilization, right? It's people. It's people who are leaving a planet in a place that is worse off than when we arrived and are going to have to grapple with that for future generations. And I think you've presented us with some ways that we can start thinking about improving that and making a difference. So thank you very much. And I will turn it over to
Thank you so much, Dr. Bhuta and Dr. Martin, for what has been an incredibly thought-provoking discussion. And thank you to Dr. Baumgartner and Ms. Buajiti for being excellent moderators. And thank you to all those who stood up to ask your questions. Your curiosity is invaluable. We've covered a wide range of questions, and the conversation was very enlightening. So, for our final order of business, I would like to, on behalf of my fellow co-MCs, we would like to thank McGill Global Health Programs for inviting us to serve as your MCs for this evening. This will be our final introduction for the night. It has been an honor and a pleasure. And now I would like to introduce Dr. Tim Evans. Dr. Evans is the Associate Dean and Director of the School of Population and Global Health, as well as the Associate VP of Global Policy and Innovation. Please welcome to the stage Dr. Evans, who will share some parting thoughts and bring tonight's event to a close.
Great. Thanks so much, Shalua, and thanks to our MCs. As any of you know me, I like alliteration, so I'm going to begin. You'll have to guess the letter that I'm going to alliterate on, but it begins with my 60 slides. So we should be out of here in the next hour. Just joking. I do want to say that this has been stimulating and sobering at the same time. We have, I would think, at least three major takeaways. First is the imperative for great scholarship. I think we've seen that in the context of our speakers, but also those who are next gens and doing great things. As Keith reminded us, it's not just the scholarship, it's actually making systems change in a way that is going to allow them to take action, not only within the health sector, across sectors, structural innovations, I heard, and I would add systems savvy. And I think perhaps most importantly is what we ended on, is this sense of solidarity. We're all in this together. There are no winners and losers in this. But we have to fight against those forces of stratification, gender, geography, which we know are critical. So with that, we have to not sit back. We have to surge ahead with speed and smartness and savviness, and make sure after 27 bad cops, with the inclusion of health, we will now have a good cop. So let's hope that Dubai delivers. With that, I'd just like to thank our stewards, the provost, Manfredi, Dean Fellows. I know if the principal was here, he would be beating the clarion of sustainability. We have our Global Health Program stewards, Charles, Madhu, and Tasha, and we have Sears, our Global Health Program IAC, led by Paul Fraser as chair. We have students, scholars, and supervisors, and I really think that if you haven't had an opportunity to look at this, it's indicative that there is real hope for the future, and we're cultivating it here at McGill campus-wide. We have major supporters and sponsors who make this possible, and we want to recognize them. We have staffers in the Global Health Program who, with so little, do so much. We have speakers, Keith, Zulfi, that was fantastic, and we had sophists who asked us important, stimulating, and sobering questions. And lastly, and perhaps most importantly, spectators who stayed with us to the end. Thank you for being a great audience, actively engaged. So we will see you next year when GHP turns sweet 16. Thank you very much.